Hello, my name is Tony Greco, and I'll be providing a presentation today entitled A Wetland Practitioner's Perspective, specifically dealing with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers 2018 Standard Operating Procedure for Compensatory Mitigation. The focus of today's presentation will be on Appendix 11.15 of the 2018 SOP entitled the Georgia Interim Freshwater Wetland Hydrogeomorphic Workbook User Manual. In general, we'll talk through the overview and components of the new SOP. We'll provide some comparison between the 2004 and 2018 SOPs. I'll provide some experiences and observations based on implementation of the 2018 SOP and provide some site-specific data, case study type data from projects that we've been working on, and then provide some recommendations for moving forward and potentially updating the SOP. To get started, I'd like to provide everybody with the location where these documents can be downloaded. There's a link below that will link you into the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Ribbits site. And all these documents can be downloaded online, and any updates to these documents are also found on this website. The purpose of the 2018 HGM SOP is to provide users with the ability to quantify wetland function to be used both for defining existing conditions as well as proposed conditions that would occur following restoration activities. In large part, this HGM is applicable to the development of compensatory mitigation banks as required under Section 404 program requirements. Consistent with other HGM guidebooks, both nationally and regionally, the HGM relies upon characterizations of hydrology and vegetation to quantify wetland function. In addition, in Georgia, this HGM also relies upon soils and climatic conditions. To calculate both existing and proposed wetland functional condition, the Georgia HGM relies upon the quantification of 5 variables, which are a subset of those variables provided in the regional guidebook for applying the HGM approach to assessing wetland functions of forested wetlands and alluvial valleys of the coastal plain of the southeastern United States. The Georgia HGM relies upon one hydrologic variable, continuous saturation, 3 vegetative variables, wetland vegetation composition, VComp, wetland vegetation structure, VStruct, and large woody debris, VWD. It also takes into account the condition of and the condition and coverage of the upland buffer. While the vegetative variables included in the HGM SOP are important for evaluating the condition and function of wetlands, the continuous saturation V hydro variable is really the most important when in driving the type of wetland and the condition of the wetland that you're evaluating. So to actually calculate a V hydro score, there are several things that you need to know. One is that the V hydro variable is contingent upon the physiographic region that your site lies within. Those are the major physiographic regions of Georgia, which are the Blue Ridge and Ridge Valley, the Piedmont, and the coastal plain. You also need to know the type of soil that is present on your site or soils, and that the V hydro score is then contingent upon the confirmed soil series. You then also use that data along with measured hydrologic dynamics to determine what the function of your particular wetland is for V hydro. That assessment is then contingent upon antecedent climatic conditions, where you really need normal conditions to establish function or to So what is needed to establish existing functional condition of a wetland? First, you need normal precipitation, so you can evaluate whether the hydrologic dynamics that are observed on the site, where those fall on the hydrologic performance curve, as depicted on the right. You need to know the type of soil, and you need at least one growing season of hydrologic monitoring data such that you can establish the maximum saturation range that occurs on a particular site. To provide an example of how the V-hydro metric is determined in the 2018 SOP, I provided a hypothetical example of a performance curve. This hypothetical site is located in the Piedmont physiographic region. The soil series for this particular location are mapped as Wood-Hadkey. And the SOP then identifies the optimal functioning saturation range of that soil type to be 10 to 12% of the growing season. So how the hydrologic performance curve works is a functional score is provided based upon the maximum number of consecutive days of saturation within 12 inches of the ground surface. So between 0 and 14 days of saturation, you receive a 0% or 0 function. This is because anything less than 14 days continuous saturation during the growing season is less than that of the wetland criteria as defined in the 1987 Wetland Delineation Manual. As saturation then increases beyond 14 days, you begin to travel along this hydrologic performance curve. So below the optimal 10 to 12% optimal functioning range, you increase, so that's the low end of that range is 27 consecutive days. So between 14 and 27 days of saturation, as you increase in saturation, you also increase in functional score. The slope of that line is what's important here, and that ultimately results in, for every day increase in saturation, your function increases by 0.08 units until you reach 27 consecutive days. Between 27 and 33 consecutive days of saturation, that is within the optimal saturation range, and thus you receive the maximum hydrologic performance score of a 1.0. As the number of consecutive days of saturation increases past 33, you begin to descend off the receding limb of this performance curve at a rate of 0.677 units per day of saturation until you reach the minimum hydrologic functional score of 0.1. That does not go to 0, as the philosophy of the HGM is that anything above 14 days consecutive saturation is considered a wetland and does have some function, although according to this particular example, that function would be impaired as it is too wet. We just walked through how the 2018 SOP quantifies wetland function. I just wanted to quickly provide a comparison between the previous SOP that was developed in 2004 and was in place up till 2018, and how the two differ briefly. In general, the 2004 SOP was largely qualitative and based on reference site approach. The other factor was that a lot of project to project determinations were made and really were negotiated between the agencies and practitioners to land a particular project on this scale of improvement. So what we had a net improvement in vegetation, a net improvement in hydrology, both of which range from a 0.1 on the low end to a 1.4 functional increase that could be realized via restoration. In between this range, it was really quite difficult to establish what type of activity resulted in a certain type of functional increase. And so it was inconsistent, but it did allow for this preliminary estimation of function. Whereas now what we have is a quantitative, unbiased means of calculating function, but we have lost then some ability to project or estimate post-project conditions, and then we have some limitations in regard to requirements of climate normality and relatively significant amount of monitoring data that's required to demonstrate wetland function. So we walked through how the V-hydro score is calculated. Now, one of the difficulties, as we all know, in these types of kind of more general assessments, is how does this actually work in real world implementation? So I've provided a case study for a site we've been working on. It's located in the Ridge Valley, to provide some insight into how the HGM works based upon various observed conditions in the field. So as we described previously, the V-hydro score is contingent upon the observation of normal climatic conditions. There's a variety of ways to look at climate normality that we're not going to get into here, but this is just to give you guys some real world data and example of how the V-hydro score is calculated. So our case study centers around monitoring years 2018 and 2019. And we had two kind of different climate conditions that were observed during that time period, both of which seem to fall within that normal range, although there were different antecedent conditions that preceded the growing season as required to be evaluated with the HGM. So in Georgia, a lot of wetland hydrologic criteria are met during early portions of the growing season. This is largely because of typically wetter winters and lower evapotranspiration rates that occur in the spring, with then kind of higher ETs that occur in the summer, more vigorous vegetation growth. So really what we're interested in going to look at here is this early growing season. So in 2018, what we had was a dry winter followed by a normal spring. In 2019, we had a wet winter followed by a normal spring. To illustrate how the antecedent climatic conditions affect wetland hydrology, I've provided now hydrologic wetland monitoring data from the same location on the same site in 2018 and 2019. So the important things to notice here is our growing season start date, as defined by the USDA WETS tables, was March 30th. And we're focusing on the early portion of the growing season when we got our maximum consecutive days of saturation at this particular well. So in 2018, that occurred from mid-April to early May, and we observed 19 consecutive days of saturation at this particular location. That equated to a V-hydro index score of 0.56, which puts us kind of on the rising limb of that performance curve. Again, same well, same site. In 2019, we now observed a maximum consecutive days of saturation of 30, which equates to a V-hydro index score of 0.75. Now, the important difference is that now we're on the recession limb of that performance curve. Now, to throw a little wrinkle in this assessment, as you can see at the purple arrow there, shows a minor deviation in 2018 below 1 foot. That value was actually negative 1.01 feet. So it fell very slightly below the minimum saturation range as required by regulation. In reality, the water table was only below 12 inches for less than 16 hours, as based upon how these loggers are logging. So if you adhere strictly to the definition, in 2018, that was maximum consecutive days of 19. But you can see that on either side of this minor deviation that we had saturation. If we ignored that drop below 12 inches, our 2018 maximum consecutive days of saturation would actually be 35 and would put us well down the recession limb of the being too wet on the hydrologic performance curve, such that in 2018, strict definition, we have a 0.56, it was too dry. In 2019, 0.75, it was too wet. And if we kind of throw out our 2018 outlier, that is a 0.24 functional score, also being too wet. As indicated, and as we practitioners are very aware well of, standardized approaches to assessment of natural systems is difficult, and natural variability poses problems in evaluating condition and assessing that condition. So I think what we've kind of gotten to is we have a standardized metric for evaluating wetland function. It's based upon a lot of science that's gone into the HGM and then even state-specific refining of that HGM as a part of the 2018 SOP. The things that are nice about the current method is that it is consistent. Historically, there was a lot of inter-project variability and how function was determined. There was potential bias in some of those assessments. The new SOP does provide kind of an unbiased assessment. It's also not dependent on a reference site approach, which is what a lot of previous mitigation banks relied upon to evaluate wetland hydrology. We all know, we just demonstrated that there's tremendous variability at a single well on a single site. And so trying to compare even between reference sites, even nearby reference sites, and a evaluation site can be problematic and is problematic. The problems and what the 2018 SOP does not provide is a good way of evaluating of conducting functional assessments without a pretty significant amount of monitoring. We have to know soils, we have to have at least one growing season's worth of hydrologic monitoring data, and then that monitoring data is contingent upon observing normal climatic conditions, which we all know is, and has just been demonstrated as being difficult as well. It also doesn't allow for the ability for us to incorporate site-specific conditions. The site that we were just looking at, the example site, is a riverine floodplain that is actively connected to the river and does flood. There are a lot of other sites that may be in riverine settings that aren't well connected with the river, and flooding does not occur. You may have slope-driven hydrology or groundwater return flow hydrology and not riverine. And this method doesn't really allow for us to evaluate those differences in hydrologic source. It also doesn't allow us to look at, if non-normal conditions are present, to evaluate function during atypical either years or seasons. From being involved in both the development and assessment of the current HGM method, as well as implementation of this method and development of a compensatory mitigation site, we've kind of thought through some recommendations that might be provided or talking points that I think are worth discussing and potential refinement of this method. I think one of the most important components could be the incorporation of some sort of qualitative assessment tool. This would allow for pre-project evaluations of potential restoration sites, such that planning could be conducted to evaluate what generally is the functional condition of a particular site. Because without that ability, we really have to go out and monitor for at least several years, which is not inexpensive, to really officially determine what the functional condition is and what the restoration functional uplift could be for a particular site. It also appears that the optimal hydrologic functional range may be too narrow. In the example that we were looking at, we had a 6-day window that received a functional score of 1. Outside of that, our function decreased quite rapidly as either the site became drier or wetter. This is really probably most important in the Piedmont and mountain regions of the state, as typically our growing seasons are shorter and our wetlands are typically not as continuously saturated like in the coastal plain. There's also regional hydrologic variability that with such a narrow range can be somewhat problematic. Again, as we kind of illustrated in our example, we were all around the optimal range, sometimes too dry, sometimes too wet. And so it's hard to really get a good picture of the hydrologic function just because of annual variability and site variability that occurs naturally. The kind of second component of that, and maybe kind of a spur of that optimal functional range, is should wetland function decrease as rapidly as is projected in the hydrologic performance curve as the site becomes too wet, in quotation marks? And should that functional score go to a minimum of 0.1? There have been conversations that too wet may or may not be bad for a particular type of wetland, and the vegetation may actually act as an indicator of if conditions are too wet or not. So that is kind of ongoing. I do believe there are potential revisions. This is a draft document that is being refined as we speak and will continue to be refined in the future. We didn't talk too much about vegetation metrics and how those components are incorporated in the HGM. There are a variety of considerations there. One of the big ones is incorporation of natural successional processes, and primarily how forested communities occur and are restored on a restoration site. A lot of the prescriptions call for the planting of really slow-growing hardwood species, which don't naturally kind of pop up in early stages of following disturbance. And so is there some sort of incorporation of maybe less desirable species that may come in and promote that evolution to a forested system that may be beneficial to evaluate in regard to wetland function. Coarse woody debris is one, and we'll just briefly touch on it. Coarse woody debris is an important function of wetlands, does provide primarily a lot of wildlife habitat, surface roughness, things of that nature. From a practitioner's perspective, the addition of coarse woody debris is relatively problematic in regard to implementation, with a lot of folks thinking that the addition of coarse woody debris may occur from actually cutting planted stems or woody stems that grow to actually achieve and the ability to meet that metric. Otherwise, you're manually bringing in wood to a site, and that in itself may cause additional disturbance that you don't want. So there's a variety of things that are being worked on. This is to provide maybe this group with some conversations to help guide potential future recommendations and refinement of the SOP.